I'm Michael Fox, and this is the Prospector News Podcast. And joining me today, I have Greg McNab. Greg is a partner at Denton's Law, part of the corporate group, and he's responsible for the energy and mining teams. Welcome aboard, Greg.
Thanks very much, Michael. It's a pleasure to be here today.
This is just a little preview of your SME talk that's going to be available starting next week. And we're going to be talking today about investment in energy infrastructure, which seems to be sorely lacking all over the world.
No, I think that's right. As usual, our friends at the SME they've lined up a topic which is near and dear to most of us, not only from our work life, but also in our everyday lives. It's hard to have a discussion in either Canada, the US, or most parts of the world without energy impacting it, whether or not it comes to the cost of living, the certainty, or, in some parts of the world, rolling brownouts and those kinds of things. So it's a very timely and important point for us these days.
I agree wholeheartedly. I'm of the belief that a lot of the challenges that we're facing right now with inflation has to do with high energy prices across the board. And that's, fueling cost inflation, which is getting out of control.
It is, and I'll put it in quotes, but I'll say the unfortunate part of it is, to me, some of this could have been prevented, right? Like by either government planning or just, I won't even just hang it all on government, but just on planning in general. So we've known for years that we were going to be making some changes to our energy mix. And we just kind of haven't picked up. We've kind of looked at it coming over the horizon, getting closer and closer. And here we are now in a position where the old energy, that, if you want to call it that, is expensive and hard to distribute and those kinds of things. So unfortunately, I think we could have seen and prevented some of this, but as they say, we are where we are. And now it's a question of like, how do we make changes and where do we go from here?
Definitely. How do we make changes and where do we go from here? If we're moving towards this new green economy, I see need for more electricity infrastructure, power lines, distribution, generation. And where are we going to find the money? Is it going to have to come from government, or is there a role for the private sector?
Well, that seems to be the question that everybody has these days on the tip of their tongue about where, and it's beyond the energy side. It's on kind of companies reinventing. It's the new tech dynamic for Canada, et cetera. But it all comes down to where's the money going to come. I think in the energy sector, I think the answer is going to be a bit of both. By that, I mean, we need a commitment from governments, and I say governments of all levels, because as you know, like energy infrastructure really is a mix of top to bottom. It's a bit like having a major subway system running through a city. You need federal involvement, provincial involvement, and then of course the city or the municipality where it's actually placed. And so we need some kind of cooperation, not only on the here's a check to sort of front end to cover some of the front end costs, which you can then recover over time, but you also you need the cooperation from those three levels of government as to the project certainty. So by that I mean, if you're going to expect industry to kind of reinvent itself and or be innovative and make changes and think about things differently, et cetera, we need a commitment from those different levels of government and the government agencies that sort of monitor and police them, that there will be synchronization across the approval process. The objectives will be aligned. So by that I mean, we don't want one level of government saying yes, we need to support fossil fuels as they transition, versus another level of government saying no, right, we've got to switch to green right away, and fossil doesn't deserve any of that support. So I mean, if I was to sum all that up, I'd say yes, we need money from government on the front end to maybe subsidize short-term investment, which can then be recovered. But we also need probably communication and just better coordinated involvement from government. That's probably the best way to put it.
Yeah, I definitely wouldn't disagree with that statement. I look to our neighbors to the south who want more and more green energy, but the Biden administration seems to block every mining program that's going to get them more copper, more nickel, more lithium. That's going to help in the transition to the green energy. It seems to be a real mixed message that's going on.
It is, and that's maybe you hit the nail on the head about the one of the challenges of anything that requires government sort of involvement and approval, and that is that the involvement in the approval process can change one government to the next. So, you know, whatever country you're in, you've got an election cycle of 3, 4, 5 years. And these energy projects that we're talking about, and even revitalizing our grid and increasing capacity, et cetera, those are 10+ year projects. And so there's an inherent disconnect in our energy infrastructure system between the government involvement that I mentioned a few minutes ago that you need to have, and the certainty for the project developers of knowing that support, and even if you're not getting financial support, but that the commitment to allow it what they're working on to go forward, it's just not there for the whole sort of life of the project, and that's where the risk of these projects, has to be somehow bridged. And so I think maybe in comparing Canada and the US, I think there's probably it seems the Biden administration is pretty passionate about some of the things they talk about, but I see over the years, I've seen there's less disruption when there is a change of government in the US, I think, than there is maybe in Canada. When things change in Canada, they change pretty sharply, they change overnight, and they're kind of black and white. But I think in the US, they certainly do, upturn or overturn some of the previous decisions. But I think there's less of a lower tendency to do that, just which helps with the certainty, the 10-year kind of window that I was talking about earlier.
You mentioned the short election cycles and how that factors into the planning. And I've looked at that, and I've looked at what happens. I'm not a big China fan, but China seems to be eating our breakfast because they look at things on a much larger scale and a much longer orbit than what we do. They seem to know where their energy is going to come from tomorrow, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now. And we can't seem to agree on where we're going to, turn the lights on tomorrow.
Yeah, and that was one of the way back when, and it was for China mining was the first event that took me to China. But that was one of the things that actually impressed me. And I know you have to be careful these days, but saying, you're impressed by things in China, but it was a very specific discussion I remember having the first time I was there, and it had to do with it was railway infrastructure. And so I was speaking with somebody from government there, and they basically decided that, or we're describing the process as, well, if the federal government decides that, there's a benefit to the country as a whole of having a high-speed rail line between A and B, well, they take a map, they draw a line between A and B, and then they figure out a way to basically move people out of the way because it's for the benefit of the country. And 6 months later, you go back and there's a high-speed rail line there. They don't have the multi-layer government intervention model that we have to deal with. They don't have, they do have a transparency process. So, they publish their 5-year objectives and generally stick to them. So for better or for worse, the government tells people up front, here's the plan for the next 4 or 5 years, and they sort of stick to that. So using your example, the energy mix, they commit to it up front, and whether or not it's carbon capture and storage as part of the mix, whether it's nuclear, it's whether or not it's solar, there's no secrets, there's no kind of hidden agendas and veiled kind of announcements, those kinds of things. So that is one of the reasons, though, that they have the country has managed to, I don't want to say dominate, but they've managed to respond faster and more efficiently, I think, to their energy demands, because their economy, like ours, has been growing at a significant rate and needs energy to power it and to build it. So I think China's just managed to get their approval process in place in a quicker, more reactive way.
Yeah, most definitely. I come from British Columbia, and you have a project there, and immediately there's a giant lineup of people who are opposed to it and are willing to fight you to the death to make sure that project never happens. And how much of that is holding us back from achieving our green energy?
Well, that's the when we were just talking a minute ago about China, that's probably the biggest difference between the Canadian system and the Chinese system, is there is a consultation process that, for better or for worse, allows people to have input on those decisions. And recently, Canada, like the US, like other parts of the world, we've had a number of all levels of government speakers talk about the fact that they're going to step up, they're going to fast track, they're going to streamline the process, etc. All of those things to ensure that energy infrastructure and mining infrastructure gets advanced at a much faster pace. And that's a difficult thing to do when you live in and when you work in a country like Canada, which does have that consultation process. So we've had it, again, for better or for worse, we've had it this way for a number of years. People see a value in it, and it's part of being in a democratic economy like Canada is. So we can't just go through the motions. And one of the things that's evolved in the energy and mining sector over the last few years has been the public consultation process, and in particular, as part of that, the engagement with Indigenous peoples, and the time we spend talking and listening and discussing things with those communities now is more significant than it used to be. Many people, I'm sure, would argue that it's still not perfect, and we still don't do as good a job of that as we should. But I think we can all probably agree that we spend more time involved in that part of the process. So by having that process in place, though, it does mean that things are just not, there is no shortcut. There is no kind of fast track and all of those things that we can sort of look to, other than what I talked about at the beginning, which is the alignment across government. So if we did have federal, provincial, and municipal alignment on these issues before project developers had to go and start having these conversations, things could potentially move quicker. But that's I think asking for all the levels of government to cooperate on all things is kind of that's a fairy tale wish list here in Canada.
Yeah, I think so. If you got 3 levels of government together, you'd have about 10 different opinions on what should happen.
Yeah, at least.
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying. Yeah, we have gotten better at consulting with our First Nations and with the general communities at large. But, there lies another challenge where everyone, it takes it as a black and white world where oil is bad, green energy is good. And the reality is that there's gray levels right across that board. They're talking about banning internal combustion engines they keep moving it. I think it's 2040 now. And they keep moving back the date because they realize that they can't make electric cars fast enough to move it out sooner. But, somewhere in the equation, do we not have to look and say, okay, maybe hybrid cars, because we can't get from A to B in the time that we want. Hybrid cars are less bad. Therefore, it's an improvement. Does it have to be, this is bad and that is good? What's your thoughts on that?
In an ideal world, and I started going, so back, it was 15 years ago now, I started going to some of the conference of the parties, or the COPs, where people first started to get passionate about climate change and the impact that energy had on climate change. And those discussions were very much about what you just described as almost, overnight, we're going to switch from, we're going to shut down all our coal-fired power plants, turn off all our nuclear reactors, and by tomorrow morning, we'll all have switched to solar, wind, and hydroelectric power. And initially, that was kind of what was demanded, but eventually, over time, at those events, and generally, we've come to the realization, and this is where the phrase energy transition comes from, that you just can't, that's not an overnight discussion or an overnight journey. And so the sensible, practical solution is exactly what you just described, is some kind of a transition plan. So where you have technology that works at both ends of that spectrum. And so you're right, there isn't the production capacity or infrastructure to even build all those electric cars, even if we wanted to. But there certainly is not the amount of mining material coming out of the ground to build all of these batteries, for example. But also on the energy infrastructure side, something as simple, and everybody always we always turn to the electric car example as the kind of, that seems like the first, easy, low-hanging fruit thing to do. If we just all switch to electric cars. The problem with that aside, if you can, get over the production hurdles and the input material hurdles, you don't have the charging infrastructure. So we do, I've got friends who have electric cars, and they have to stop when they drive to Ottawa or Belleville. They've got to stop halfway along and wait at a McDonald's for an hour and a half while they recharge. So we just don't have that infrastructure yet. Canada, it's like Australia. It's a big, wide open country with a relatively small number of people. And so for the same reason that we have expensive cell phone costs, we have expensive energy distribution costs. So the idea that we can just suddenly switch to this green energy and put all the old energy behind us, I think it's flawed. And I do think we do need to do exactly what you've just described, which is take more of an interim kind of transition approach to these things, and just be a little bit more sensible in our planning. And so, which, everybody gets it's a very passionate topic. So everybody gets very worked up, and they want to know why we can't do much more and do it sooner and do it faster and do it cheaper and all that stuff. But I think the reality is, never mind putting aside, how hard it is to change human behavior. Adaptation just takes a long time, and it's gonna take us a lot of time here in Canada as well.
Yeah, when we have these discussions, reality kind of dissipates and disappears at times. Unfortunately, when you have people that are pretty passionate about a subject, we simply don't have the technological ability to get from A to B in the length of time that they want. It's it's as simple as 1 and 1 plus 1 equals 2. It can't be 3.
Yeah. Well, and that's one of the, again, like we talked earlier about the consultation process, but I think that's probably one of the things that most of us would agree on, is one of the reasons we like living in Canada. And, the US is a pretty close neighbor and equal to us on this point, which is we can, because it is such a passionate and important topic for so many people, we can have a discussion about it. And so, and by a discussion, it's not just, we're allowed to talk about it freely without fear of being kidnapped by the police in the middle of the night. It's not just that, it's that we can actually have a discussion and hopefully have some impact on government policy, and how quickly the government does certain things, and whether or not they even do certain things. So I think that's the good and the bad of what I was talking earlier about. Just here in Canada, you can be part of that discussion if you want, but there is, as you just mentioned, there's going to be a cost to taking one position or another in terms of timing and how quickly we actually get some of the things we want. But at the end of the day, hopefully, there's going to be a feeling that the majority of Canadians or Americans, if you're on that side of the border, at least had some input and had some involvement in the change and wherever we end up going.
Yeah, well, otherwise, you get that, we're not going to let government tell us what we're going to do kind of attitude that comes with dictatorial platitudes that come down from high. It's really interesting, though, you mentioned about the early stages of all of this when they talked about, how we needed to get to green energy, and hydro was included in that. There's a large hydro dam project in northern British Columbia in the Peace River Valley, referred to as Site C, and people are still arguing and fighting that shouldn't be built, yet they want the electricity for all these new electric cars that are coming. So how do we get the environmental movement to square that, there is going to be some cost to what they want?
Well, you've hit on another issue that's fragmented within Canada. I mean, when we talked earlier about the federal, provincial, municipal discrepancy, but there's also within Canada, and it's directly on point to this question, there's a difference in views on energy. So if you're from Alberta and you grew up in that area, then you're going to have a very, I don't want to say fossil fuel friendly view, but you're going to have a recognition of what that industry has contributed to the economy there, but also the future of what it could possibly contribute. And when we all sit back and every government and every people likes to think if we only had more money, we could solve all of our social problems. So for Canadians who look around, they see, an opportunity like undeveloped fossil resources, which have a finite lifetime to them. So 50 years from now, we're probably not going to be pulling oil out of the ground and putting it in cars. So there'll be something else. So the idea that we leave it there and then never develop it, well, there's a lost opportunity cost associated with that. But if you're using your BC example, if you're in BC versus Alberta versus Ontario versus Quebec, which I think the last time I saw the number, it was 94% of Quebec's electricity generated from hydroelectric projects. That is a shocking number in terms of what that sector or what that type of energy can bring to the table. And so it is a bit surprising that, so if I had to pick another province other than Quebec where I would have thought that kind of project development would have gone ahead and be well received, it probably would have been British Columbia. And so, but the Project C example, like that discrepancy still is probably because it has to be an extreme example in the first place because BC is generally in renewable energy friendly. But that is where the discussion point we talked about earlier about the consultation process and the people involved going head to head with a desire to have kind of relatively friendly energy sources. And it's not an easy conflict to resolve. And it's always easy to armchair quarterback these situations. But what I do think has to happen is there has to be a decision maker. So we can't have a perpetual cycle of questions, consultations, then reconsultations, and then appeals and all those kinds of things. That's not fair to either side. And so whether or not you're on the project side or the environmental side, I mean, community groups, they don't want to face the expectation of hundreds of millions of dollars of legal fees and, an ongoing fight for 15 or 20 years. And in the end, something might happen that they didn't expect to happen at all. So I do think when I talked earlier about coordination across government levels and processes, and I do think that is part of the discussion as well. It's like, how do we improve the process so that these kinds of conflicts get resolved one way or the other? I don't want to say quicker, but with more finality and more certainty. And so I don't think there's an easy answer in this case, but it is frustrating, I think, for all people involved to know that there's no final answer yet without further delays and expense.
Yeah, I will defer to the fact that the BC government failed in its consultation process with the key players in that particular project, and it is a Crown Corporation project through BC Hydro. It's a challenge all around, but I also believe that I think we need a quicker process, through, so that whether it's government money, private sector money goes towards a project, they have a definitive answer quickly as to whether or not that project is ever going to see the light of day. Too many projects kind of get strung along where it's sort of like, you're meeting somebody at the bar and you think maybe you're going to go home with them at the end of the night, and end of the night comes and you've invested a lot of drinks and you go home alone. It's kind of that kind of process where, at any 11th hour, a new argument could be made that will quash a project. And the amount of money and effort that's gone into that point has been for naught.
Yeah, and there's the additional, when you're talking about things like energy and new types of energy in particular, there's the additional risk that, and that by the time, you know, you look at whether or not it's 5, 6, 7, 8 years have gone by, the technology has changed. So, you know, you originally applied for some kind of solar project of a certain kind based on technology available at that time. 4 years go by, 5 years go by, and then you find out that, you know, if the project has failed for X number of reasons, you then have to reevaluate and go back to the drawing board of, is that technology even relevant anymore? How else are we now? You're also now farther behind on the curve of filling the gap of our modeled energy needs. So by presumably when you first started talking to the government actors involved, there was a model that you know, predicted by this period in time we're going to need this amount of energy. So when you turn down those projects that were going to fill those gaps, you're indirectly saying to people in these communities, listen, we are not going to be able to, you're not going to have the energy you thought you were going to have to because energy's it's not there's not an abundance of it. There's no infinite source of it. So you have to make, if we're going to not approve projects and do things more efficiently, then there's a cost to that. And so you're going to have to say to industries, perhaps like mining or production, that you're now not going to have the energy available to you that you thought you were going to have. So there's a bunch of cost to these kinds of decisions that spin out from just the initial yes, no, you didn't talk to enough people for long enough kind of stuff. There's disappointments across the economic spectrum.
Yeah, we are very far removed from the original Kyoto Accords. We've had, you know, at least, I don't know, I think there's 5 other accords since then. It was redefined and restructured that climate agreement. And we don't seem to be anywhere closer to having the infrastructure needed to achieve the goals of those accords. If governments are cutting checks that they can't cash, you know, what kind of an impetus is there out there to actually start moving the investment into these infrastructures that we need?
Well, the one thing that has changed, and because you're right, the original plans were very kind of country focused, and so the one thing that has changed coming out of the Paris Agreement was just the concept that governments could support projects in different parts of the world and count that towards their commitment. So if it makes sense, you know, for a country like Canada to develop an LNG project and export, you know, LNG to pick a country, I don't know, Singapore, India, China, because the net benefit to the globe of having China or Singapore or India not use coal or not use nuclear or whatever, so that there would be a net benefit to the economy and to the globe. That kind of concept is now much more recognized, and there's a mechanism in place now to deal with those kinds of situations. So I think in part, to answer your question about the kind of the match of government almost government asks and promises and failed delivery on stuff, there is now an opportunity to have discussions across governments between countries to help soften that a bit. So you know, using the example I just set out there, you could have some kind of a cooperation between a China, India / Singapore to fund some of this development work in a place like Canada or the US or wherever the LNG is going to come from, to spread the cost of that across different countries. The problem with all of that, though, is it's in part political. So when you have discussions at the highest levels of any country's government, the politics behind it mean they shift over time, and the commitments that a government might have made 5 years ago or maybe hard to enforce now. But you also have the idea that governments are they're responsive to the needs of their people in kind of real time. And so if they need an energy project that does a certain thing for their economy, then that's what they're going to pay for. But that may change before the first thing that they ask for is actually built. So I think we're in a slightly better place than we were initially when we first started talking about all this international kind of abatement, and but we're also in a better place because I think now we've gotten away from when I first started going to these things. The discussion was always around, well, why would Australia or Canada even do anything like that? Because the US isn't doing it, and China's not doing it, India's not doing it. We've gotten over that hurdle, and I think there's now. I definitely would not, walk into a bar in Alberta and want to scream out loud that Alberta should do more to save the environment in China and India and Singapore. But I think there is now more of an acceptance that we can all contribute to a solution without being having to be the first one or the last one, or keeping track of who's in the pool and who isn't yet.
I appreciate the argument that things are a little bit more that way, but I'm wondering if the environmentalists and the government have gotten that memo, because Germany came looking for LNG as recent as a few months ago to keep them from having to go back to coal, and our government offered them hydrogen 30 years from now.
Yeah, that was I remember exactly what happened there, and I think that was mismanaged. That could have been managed differently on a number of fronts. One being, we should have at least been much more open to a discussion, because it's a time of need from one of our fellow community partners, or whatever the label is that we want to put on them. But I think that was not the right thing to offer them at the time. But we also have the issue of we could have used that as a reason to prop up and do something that we've been talking about doing for years. So, that would have been a sound business rationale for turning around to the Canadian sector and saying, well, look, now we've got a real need for what we could be doing with LNG. We always thought we did, but it's clearly demonstrated now. And so let's get on it, and let's take some steps and do some things that we should have done before. And I just haven't seen that reaction yet. I think it's more of the as you said, hydrogen in decades from now instead of a much shorter term solution.
Yeah, as a Canadian, I was really disappointed in that myself. I liken that to say Ethiopia, who it's a starving nation asking us for food, and we say, well, when the rains come back, here's some seeds. It doesn't help solve the problem today, So you're going to be doing a more in-depth discussion on these topics for the New York division of the Society of Metallurgical Engineers coming up starting next Tuesday. Tell me about that.
Yeah, that's right. So there's our friends at the SME, as I mentioned at the beginning, have done a pretty good job of staying on top of things over the last couple of years when we couldn't get together in person, to put together a suite of sort of virtual conferences to keep us talking about some of these important things. And this is a good example of it. So the event starts on January the 10th, and I think it's focused on thought leadership in different aspects of energy and mining. And so I know our mutual friend Tim Alch has been kind of spearheading that, and I think that's how most of us have actually become part of the discussion. But over the years, I've spoken and attended a number of the SME events, and what I do like about them, and I think that's probably what we're going to get out of this virtual series, is the discussions are much more focused on practical and kind of what can be done differently now discussions, rather than sort of high-level theoretical post-game analysis of why things didn't change in the past. And so, much like the mining finance conferences that the SME puts on usually in April and May, they bring together kind of people who are interested in kind of actual discussions about what can be done now. And so I look forward to hearing the other speakers and what they've got to say starting on January the 10th.
I am looking forward to that as well. I've attended several and been involved with several of Tim's events, pre-COVID live in person and post-COVID online, and he always has a very wide-ranging and interesting lineup of speakers on a good range of topics. For those of you that would like to have access to those videos, they will be on demand and available starting on January the 10th. And below the description of this particular podcast, I will put the registration link. You need to register, and then you'll have access to the videos to watch at your leisure over the next several months. And the next SME event will be in early about, I guess, mid-May, the 8th to the 11th of May in New York. If you're so inclined to come and join them in person, it'd be a good opportunity for you. Greg, thank you very much for taking the time to talk about the energy infrastructure today, and I look forward to continuing this conversation down the road.
Thanks very much, and I appreciate the chance to talk to everybody.
The Prospector News podcast is for educational purposes only. The opinions expressed are those of the participants and are not to be taken as investment advice. Listeners need to do their own due diligence and seek advice of a licensed investment advisor.